Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the second of the series on the AIA Guides of Equitable Practice, Cultural Competence Part 2. My name is Natasha Espada and I'm the 2020 BSA President and the founding principal of Studio NA Architects. For the past 3 years, I've been one of the co-chairs of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force at the BSA, and it has really been an important focus of my presidency. So in the spring of 2018, just to follow up for those who weren't at the first of the series, we created the BSA Task Force on EDI plus H, so Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Harassment, to promote equity in the profession. And we created a matrix of items, and then we divided it into 4 goals. So we have advocacy, support, education, and measurement. So currently, just to give an update, we're revising the matrix that we created back in 2018 this month to both make sure that we have been on task and also to include additional items relevant to current issues that are happening, including Black Lives Matters, or more importantly, right this second. Since the first session of this series, besides working on the update to the BSA EDI matrix, we've also created an EDI and an LGBTQ knowledge community. And we also have a very active WID and Boss Noma knowledge community. So please go to the BSA website, architects.org, to see upcoming meetings. I also want to mention that we have a couple of initiatives coming up, or webinars. One is Greg Minot, he's the 2021 BSA president, and I will be kicking off a series on racism on July 28th from 12 to 1:30. So we're working on it right now. Stay tuned for more information on that. This will be the first program in a series that we're trying to put together aimed at listening, learning, and engaging Black architects and other industry professionals intent on designing and building for equity. So for the first session, before the town hall discussion begins, we will be asking 5 Black architects to speak about their experience as Black architects in academia and in our profession. And the purpose is to ground the town hall discussion in reality. So we will then open it up a conversation with questions. We're also working with colleges and universities to reach out to more diverse architecture schools in other states to see if we can bring a more diverse population of intern architects into Massachusetts. And then we're also going to be putting together a guide for EDI best practices for firms. We hope to have this out in August. So before we get started, I want to remind us that design and social equity are critically linked. And when designers come together to change the systems that perpetuate violence and cruelty, we will be able to create more just, equitable, and inclusive communities. And your participation today is just the beginning. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Emily Grandstaff-Rice, FAIA, who is my friend and who is amazing and who will be hosting this series again today. Emily is a senior associate at Arrow Street. She's also an architect with experience on a broad range of academic, hospitality, institutional, and commercial projects. Emily was the 2014 president of the BSA and is a member of the AIA College of Fellows. She is currently serving as at-large director on the National AIA Board of Directors and is chairing the National Commission on Equity and Future of Architecture Committee. So, Emily, we're excited to hear about equity today.
Thank you. Like last time, I am still in St. Louis. That's the silver lining of COVID-19 is that my ability to quarantine and move allows me to be with family a little bit more. What's awkward about it is that I'm in my parents' basement. So there's always some fun treasures like a relief map of Missouri. So I'm pretty sure nobody else finds that in their basement. So anyway, a little bit of humor. So why don't I get started? I want to begin today with acknowledging with humility that the land where I'm zooming in from today belonged to the elders of the Osage Nation. I honor the Osage Nation and am reminded to be aware that the people of the current day St. Louis occupy their homeland and that their presence is imbued in this land and these rivers. I also want to acknowledge the land that many of you are joining us from today are the original homelands, the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah-Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations. I acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we virtually gather. So thank you for joining me again. I think that there was a lot of information in the last one, and I'm going to do a quick recap. But also for those of you who are joining us for the first time, don't worry, you won't be behind. And then if there are any questions that come in the chat, Natasha, just ask, if you want to, if it's an appropriate time or want to say that, that would be great. I do acknowledge that I have a tough time monitoring the chat and speaking at the same time. So there's that. Also, And I will also say that my captions are not working because it's telling me that I'm too quiet. So can I be heard properly? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So it's just a computer glitch. So normally I'd have captions at the bottom of my screen, but it looks like it's not working today. Okay, so I started off last time talking about a statement that's really always resonated with me from Ivanu Love Stanley. Is this the profession you really want it to be? And the question, and the answer for me is always not, it's not yet. But in the work that we do, it has the ability to become, as some say, sort of as the United States is the more perfect union. This can also be the more, more just and equitable profession. Diversity, we know, brings innovation, that when you bring in lots of perspectives and mixed ideas, that you also can become more creative. We also know that respect and diversity has a direct link to productivity and profit. And a culture that is too strong can end up being too rigid and can shut out diversity, and especially diversity of perspective. So one of the nuances I want to talk about a little bit today is how you define a culture of your firm that embraces equity, diversity, inclusion, but it's not too strong that it excludes others. So the future doesn't look like the past. So we know that, especially today in 2020, there's an urgency, there's an impact in design, that diversity, inclusion, and will be mainstream. It's going to be beyond a checklist, and it's really about wholeness and advocacy. So all I will say in this quick recap is our greatest power is our voice, and by having these conversations, we can really create change. Okay, so one of the things that I talked about a lot last time was a long introduction to identity. And we did a little bit of an exercise where we came up with our own identity qualifiers, right? So some would say, I'm in my 40s, identify as female, I'm an architect. Right now, I'm a primary caregiver to a parent. And let's see, what else? I like to paint, whatever. And we did an exercise where you had to cross one of those off. And usually the first one that you cross off is pretty easy, but by distilling yourself down to one identity, it doesn't always tell you the whole picture. And when we have to think about people, we're many different perspectives and identities in that. And it's not just that one qualifier, which many times is physical attributes that you can see when you're meeting people. So identity also depends on the context. So when one is determining whether an identity is positive or negative, right? It's about the environment in which you're making that context. I did the study abroad in India, and that for me was the formative experience, because for the first time I didn't physically look like many of the people on the street. And for a pretty naive, sheltered Midwest kid, that was eye-opening for me. And I still had privilege in that, but understanding that the context leads a lot to ways in which we judge. And so just to give you some terms, whichever identity is in the norm, so recognizing by seeing who is favored in systematic outcomes is considered the dominant identity of culture. Whichever is the minority is different, it's considered non-dominant. So dominant, non-dominant. And those can change, right? A target identity is a social identity group that is discriminated against, marginalized, oppressed, or exploited by someone in dominant cultures, systems of institutions. So an agent is an identity that has advantages by birth or acquisition and knowingly or unknowingly receives unfair benefit or privileges over members of targeted groups. So dominant, non-dominant, target, those who are discriminated against, and agent, those who are privileged by this system. And one point that I want to make is that most people possess both target and agent identities. So I don't want this to be a situation where you feel like it's literally a polarity. Some people would say black or white, but we all have a spectrum by which we make these identities. And it's crucial to understand that many people have an agent identity in our profession, whether they want it or not. And that's because we are a white collar profession. We have education. I can get into a diatribe about how perhaps we should expand the education on opportunities in which one can become an architect, but we are, by many different regulations and statutes, both legally and also professionally, we have privilege just by the fact that we're architects. And having one or more agent identities does not mean that you knowingly or purposely use your identity unfairly over members of targeted groups, but you benefit from this privilege whether or not you're aware of it. And I think what's interesting is I think over the last 2 months, a lot of people are, I should say a lot of people, a lot of white dominant culture people are becoming aware of that privilege in a way that they hadn't been able to express or acknowledge before. And I find this to be a really interesting time to have some of these conversations. So the AIA, the iceberg is not exclusive to the AIA, but this is a graphic that we created to talk about ways in which diversity sometimes is considered what's above the waterline in the iceberg. So those physical attributes that you can see, but in many cases, those other identities are something below the surface that are not physically visible by looking at someone. And so there's that contrast above the line, below the line. And that's always important to remember, especially when you're thinking about nuance and how you start to enter these conversations. So I actually really enjoy revisiting the list to the right because I think it starts to flesh out what some of the target or non-targets are based on different types of biases or oppressions that we've got, right? So in racial, it's often sort of white dominant culture versus people of color, right? Class, right? There's obviously a preference one or the other. And this is, this is not a absolute list, but I think when you go down the list, many times it starts to unravel ones that you didn't necessarily recognize. For me, so the military service is an interesting one that I had not been, and it's probably a function of my age, I'm 44, that I was not attuned to that bias in terms of military service and needing to be aware of that. And, it's just an interesting thing. So I would like today to be a little more interactive, only because I acknowledge that I was talking a lot last time. I want to take a pause and see if there's any questions or thoughts in my quick recap or things that you wanted to ask last time that you didn't have an opportunity to ask.
Emily, we don't have any questions up to now, but I don't know if anyone wants
Sure.
to add any questions.
Okay, I'll keep going. And if something comes to your mind, just stop me. So this really is a wind up to then talk about bias, which is the judgment of one identity over another or one perspective over another. And bias can be implicit or explicit. So, it can be seen or it can be subtle or microaggressions, and it can occur at multiple levels, at the level of the individual, the group, and the institution. It's funny, it's not funny. I was listening to public radio this morning, and there was a very interesting discussion with, and I'm going to forget the gentleman's name who wrote The Color of Law, Robert, I think it's Rosenfeld or something like that. That's a great book to talk about how the urban policy planning had a implicit or an institutional bias in terms of redlining and creating communities across the United States. So one of the things that struck me is that there are lots of policies that are non-racially based, and the government has been saying, well, they're bias free because they don't preference one or the other, but in many cases they actually perpetuate systems that had been created much further. And the specific point that they had given was in Cook County, Illinois, many African-American Black families had higher assessed property taxes than the dominant group. And it was about being transparent about the ways in which the Cook County assessed properties, and also sort of gave that, thank you, Allison, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. So it's just sort of fascinating, and I love the fact that people are becoming more aware of things that have been happening for many, many years. There's also a great video that, in case you can't read the full book, there's a 10-minute video that someone did based on The Color of Law, and I'll find the link and sort of pass it on to BSA staff. So explicit bias occurs when one group is conscious of the prejudices and attitudes towards a certain group. Implicit biases are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner and are activated involuntarily without awareness or intent. And they can be positive or negative. So it's about being aware to combat some of the implicit biases that occur. So it can be conveyed by culture, politics, social settings, laws. I tried to give a quick example about laws, major events in mass media. One of the things that I talked about briefly last time was bias towards those who are have the ability to hear in public events, right? And acknowledging that that is something that we need to overcome and make those accommodations for those who are deaf or the hard of hearing. When we acknowledge that we're receiving messages about who is and is not acceptable or competent, we can begin to notice, name, and reprogram how we receive that information. So we can investigate our instincts to uncover where we learn certain values, thoughts, and behaviors, and monitor, adjust, and improve how we share new messages that do not inadvertently reinforce dominant culture frameworks. So some moments where I've had to do gut checks of mine have been catchphrases, and I'm going to come up with an awkward situation because I forgot to do the research on this, but simple things such as like the peanut gallery, learning the history behind that and sort of some of the racial overtones of what the peanut gallery was and why I probably shouldn't say that to my kids over time. And I think as we're starting to become more aware, so that notice and name, be able to call people out or talk about why that might not be appropriate. Like a perfect example is the Washington Redskins right now, right? On one hand, there was the narrative, no way I am ever going to change my team name. And now we are in a complete flip a couple months later of this is something that needs to be done. It's based in context, but it's also when people, and specifically the sponsors in this case, were very vocal and said, we don't feel comfortable with this anymore in the context, that there was action that was taken. Okay.
Like, can I add something to this? We had, for the
Yes, please.
diversity and inclusion group, had Malia Lazu, who was one of our co-chairs and was a board member of the BSA at the time, 2 years ago, gave a talk on unconscious biases. And I'm Puerto Rican, I'm a woman architect, and you don't realize all these unconscious biases and things that society has already kind of ingrained in you without you really thinking the implications of it. So it happens to all of us. We, even those who think that they don't have any biases, we all do. And so it doesn't, I mean, I think it's something for all of us. We're not trying to pinpoint any particular group. I guess we're saying everyone has them, and then how are you aware of them?
Yeah, and Dan Peruzzi added, sadly the team owner didn't do it altruistically. I completely agree, Dan. It's some of us take a little bit longer to get there, and to Natasha's point, it's important to think about, no matter where you are on the spectrum or whatever your experiences are, we all have them, and thinking about them.
And it's just being aware of it, right? So it's just,
yeah.
We're all unaware of those things that we're biased about. And so it's just bringing them to light. And so that was a great session that we had with Malia.
Excellent. So people have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? You're going to hear that a lot. You've probably heard it before. And have the right facilitation approach, acknowledging where there's tension in the room, set the stage at bias training so people know that they might hear things they don't like, but they are there to learn. What I have heard in the last 2 months is that many firms and groups, actually, I sat in on AIA Oregon doing a listening session on racial injustice. I sat in on AIA Los Angeles. That because many of these discussions are quite personal, that it's difficult to have them sort of in a larger public setting. And so we're seeing more small groups, but most of all, they need to be non-judgmental because people are working through years or decades of experience. I used to have a coworker who said it was your baggage, right? Working through some of that to come to the realization. But having that conversation is great. But it must always be in a safe space and non-judgmental in a way, because otherwise it can backfire. So let me start to dig a little deeper into types of implicit bias, right? So you can be able to notice and name some of them and think about sort of the nuances on them. So anchoring bias has to do a tendency to rely on the first observation or piece of information. And my father has a phrase that would always say to us growing up, always right, never uncertain. In other words, kind of the first impression, whatever you thought was right, sometimes it was much more difficult to unwind and recognize that perhaps you were wrong, or there could be information or a change of perspective as you go forwards. And so I'm always cognizant that I need to work through anchoring bias sometimes because we have to make so many quick decisions. Sometimes it takes a while to unravel. Affinity bias, so bias towards people who are like ourselves. Don't get me wrong, I love architects. It's great. But sometimes I have to recognize that sometimes it's good for me to also think about ways in which I can find things outside of that. Attribution bias, so bias in evaluating reasons for your own and others' behaviors. So this one is a little nuanced in that justifying the ways in which people act, right? And we're seeing some of that play out on the national context, the national political spot. But that one, it goes a little bit into affinity bias, but making assumptions for the way in which people are acting. And it's a tricky one that we have to monitor. Blind spot, so identifying biases in others, but not in oneself. Oh, that never happens, right? Confirmation bias, so seeking information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. This is a really difficult one, especially with people of color and or actually women, or frankly any target group. So you're looking for ways to reinforce what your original judgment was, or your expectation of the way in which that target group should behave. Conformity bias. So bias is caused by peer pressure because others within your group feel that way. The halo effect. So thinking everything about a person is good because you like that person. Some people, it's a little more extreme of benefit of the doubt, but acknowledging that is pervasive in architecture often. In-group bias, so perceiving positively people who are similar to those in the group. Also, the other would be out-group bias, so perceiving negatively people who are different than those in the group. Are you like me? Are you not like me? Does that affect the way in which I interact with you? And of course, perception bias, so the inability to make objective judgments about members of certain groups because of stereotypes. So how do I say this? The likelihood of increased bias happens when we try and let's say, in many cases, bias is implicit or explicit, but there are opportunities for implicit bias to, let's say, ramp up. And of course, during a certain emotional stress, we're seeing that in the context now of a global pandemic, plus some incredibly egregious acts, especially against people of black and brown skin, which has been happening for many years. I'm not saying that this is a unique time, but it is a unique time. I'm playing both sides of it, but I think we need to recognize that we are having a critical conversation, and perhaps that critical conversation is happening because there are so many other things going on. Also where there's ambiguity. In other words, it is increased bias happens when we make quick decisions, and that we're relying more on that instinct of working through what we believe is one way or another, rather than giving people sort of a more nuanced perspective look. So if social categories are easily recognizable, it's easy to put people into buckets, right? When the effort put into thinking is low, and often that happens during stress and during ambiguity, right? Under pressured circumstances, and also where there's lack of feedback. And the reason why I think this is important is think back to that 5 identity exercise that we did. If you're only identifying yourself by a singular, then you will have increased bias because you won't be able to give the nuance of the many different ways in which you bring yourself to this profession. I'm going to give a quote. This is from one of the guides, interview that we did. The most significant biases towards me are for being female and Asian, and then sometimes looking young. When I sense that someone is engaging with me as if I were in my 20s, I mention that my son is in 7th grade, or if I feel like they are reacting differently to me because I'm a woman, I might try and be less assertive or more assertive, or more assertive, less assertive, more assertive. And then sometimes I just say, screw it, I'll be whomever I want to be, and you can take it or leave it. I see increase in bias against older generations, both male and female, and because of it, we are losing experienced individuals and the firm's important legacy. And that was from a principal in Orner. So why is this important? One of the goals of the guides was that it spoke to multiple audiences. So it spoke to the way in which you could act as an individual in your own interactions with people in the profession. It also spoke to firms and how they can move this effort forward. And it also spoke to the larger profession and sort of, I think, many ways, the work that the BSA does, and could have a larger conversation as professional colleagues. And what Etienne Anger would say, so the learning community. It is important to understand that there are elements of federal and state law and professional ethics that guide discrimination, and it is important to also understand sort of how those play into bias, especially when it's implicit and it can be documented, and it is important to always know what those parameters are. I'm not going to go too much into it. But also the AIA Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and things that we have signed on as members to conduct the behavior in which we do. And I will talk about some changes that were made in 2018. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. Based on sort of different biases, are there any questions or comments or ahas? Okay. Okay, I'll keep moving on. So access for intercultural competence. This is kind of the work that you got to do yourself. Where is each person starting from with respect to bias and cultural awareness? What biases and intercultural tendencies are dominant in your organization? So some big questions. How are you interrupting bias and building intercultural capacity? Is intercultural thinking developed as a framework for awareness? Can employees shift their perspective and behavior in a variety of cultural contexts? And is increased intercultural capacity cultivated at all levels? Those are really big picture questions, but some things that you can ask yourself, and I would go back to Invenue Love Stanley's, or is this the profession you want to be? And if you map that out to so many of these questions, you might find that as a person, as a firm leader, a little L, big L, or as someone in the profession, that there might be ways in which you can affect change going forward.
And I,
So, yeah, go ahead.
Carol Wedge had to come off, but she said, I would add the importance of recognizing power and bias and how hard it is to address bias at the owner principal level for the younger people in the firm. And this is something that I have been sending out emails to firm principals, because everything has to change. The culture of a firm is kind of set by the leadership, and there are some grassroots that are happening, but if the leadership is not involved in it, it is hard to see change. And so I think that is really important to say, that we want to make sure that everyone is committed and is involved at all levels. And I've been on a lot of these meetings every day, basically, almost every day. And some of the things that I've been hearing is that principals are now asking minority groups in their offices or the different generations, getting their opinions, and they're in shock by what they hear because they've never really asked them before. And so I think that is pretty critical to open the communication to understand how all the different generations are feeling within an office.
Excellent. So I 100% agree with Carol, and I think as firm leaders, you do have an extra responsibility, but in many cases, I think firm leaders are struggling a little bit to figure out how they can grow or what their point is in the larger conversation. And so hopefully this will help flesh out some of that. So as an individual, one of the first things you can do is build capacity for noticing, naming, culture, and bias. So that's why the guides go through different terms so that you can understand what an agent versus a target is. You can understand dominant versus non-dominant and begin to have the vocabulary, even in the various biases, to understand and one of the key points in notice and naming is understanding what you're noticing and naming. And microaggressions, if you don't know what those are sometimes comments that are not overtly, how do I say this, in your face, right? But are sort of small little things. Ones that have always bugged me are, let's say when someone refers to, like, they're giving a hypothetical scenario and they're saying, well, Mr. Architect, what do you think? Well, as a female architect, like, give me a break, right? That's not the qualifier. There isn't sort of only sort of male architect, right? Or ones which, it's just little things that sometimes grind at you. And just as Carol had said, sometimes if you are an individual and you are, let's say, not in a position of power, you feel like you don't have the ability to confront that person in power, to then talk about why that doesn't make you feel comfortable. So I think we need to be able to have that level of communication so that it goes forward. And there isn't sort of misunderstanding. Know your role and be proactive, and of course be a good manager. It's you, in whatever level you are, you have the ability to shape those interactions and go forward. One sort of testimony here is I was the only woman in a coordination meeting, and when the agenda came to my scope of work, I spoke up to add information to the discussion. An older male turned to me and said, when you're 50 and a man, then you can speak. Everyone laughed but me. He came to my desk later and put his hand on my shoulder and said with a grin, hey, I was just joking, He never asked me what I thought or how I felt. In retrospect, I can see how occurrences like this have impacted my understanding of identity career. And one would say sort of the touching of the shoulder is, definitely in the context of Me Too, that's a whole different conversation. But even sort of the microaggression of, when you're 50 and you're a man, so it's sort of the ageism, right? The gender of it. But also dismissing it of, hey, I was just joking. And the person of whom is giving this testimony sort of doesn't feel like they have the ability to speak up and give that forward. So
So Emily,
wait,
excuse me, there's a
yeah, go
question
ahead.
here. There's a question related to that as a young emerging architect, how can we address racial microaggressions and passive comments from a superior in a manner that is not detrimental? Oops, people are writing and
Yeah, no, no, good.
I lost, but are not
No,
detrimental to the future of the individual.
yeah, I think one of the ways would be, so one strategy is sometimes I'll just say, excuse me, and then I'll just sort of stop. And it's a way in which you just haven't completely said that's inappropriate. I love Sarah's comment, which was that isn't a micro, it's pretty blatant, shut up. But you know, I think as a young emerging architect, find someone that you feel comfortable saying this to, if that exists within your firm. If you feel comfortable, or if you feel comfortable confronting the person in power, then be able to do it in a I shouldn't say confront. If you feel comfortable having that conversation, I think it is worth having that conversation just to explain your perspective. If you don't have that relationship, find somebody else who can mediate that. I know that there is a whole spectrum, whether it's a small firm, whether there's HR or not, but I think finding ways, your greatest power is your voice, finding ways to be able to express that. Natasha, you and I know that sometimes it's helpful just to have a friend to talk through some of these things and to be able to work it through. I don't have a great answer, but I think you having those conversations, whether it be with the person directly, somebody indirect, or somebody outside of the firm, is sort of the best way to go forward.
And there are also, if you can't find a mentor in your office or someone that you feel comfortable talking to, you can always find someone outside of your office who can guide you through it. Rebecca also asked a question that says,
Yeah, how do you acknowledge that even if you may be a member or a group that is identified as target, once you are in a position of power, you become dominant. So you need to behave with that understanding. That's often I'll just say, I acknowledge that I'm in a position of power, and you know, this is sort of an awkward dynamic. Um, and many times when you become a manager or a leader, I wouldn't, how do I say this? Um, you know, there isn't always sort of formal training for it. So you're making this up as you go along too. I mean, there's experience, obviously, but you know, elements of being a good manager, I think, are being humble, and also recognizing that in different contexts, you know, you need to continue to keep learning, if that makes sense. And Josh Safdie, you're absolutely right. You know, his comment said, you know, the other 50-year-old men around the conference table needed to step up and disrupt the behavior. And you're right, there's sort of this peer pressure and how you become an ally. I mentioned last time that the AIA has this great series called Bias Interrupters, offered by Joan C. Williams of the University of California, Hastings. And she gives very explicit ways in which you can start to interrupt some of that conversation. So I think I'm going to keep moving on to sort of the act of the firm. So, you know, critical ways that you as a firm can start to recognize biases is understand your intercultural capacity in your biases. So kind of figure out where you are in the spectrum. There's a great sort of Harvard multiple choice test that can kind of evaluate what your own implicit bias is. That's an individual, but if you as a group of firm leaders want to talk about that, that's sort of a nice impartial way to give a litmus test of where you are on the spectrum. Obviously communicate your culture. And I think a lot of that is happening these days. We've seen a proliferation of support statements and diversity statements out of big corporate to even small firms about what does it mean to be a culture that supports Black Lives Matter or diversity and inclusion. And those will fall short unless you also have an action plan or a way in which you can do the work internally to support that larger statement. And so I think that is, I think I'm seeing a lot of growth in that side. I also fear that many of those statements are can be hollow without you doing the work to go forward. Okay, so acting as a profession, I think the biggest thing is knowing what's happening. Being able to attend things like this are huge. Natasha, I applaud the EDIH committee as well as some of the upcoming programs that you're going to have. I think for us to learn as a learning community is very important in engaging culture and bias profession-wide. So I will say, you know, the AIA board of directors are looking at some pretty extraordinary things that we need to think about as a larger organization, understanding that this is the right time and place. So hopefully I'll have some more news as we go forward, but there's some big things coming in the future from the national organization. Another sort of testimony, I was interested in a leadership position at a firm that was opening up a new office. The only reason they could give me for not being selected was that they couldn't see me fitting in the back room, which was all men. All of the women staff, or all the women on staff were administrative. They were concerned that they wouldn't be able to cuss and it would change the dynamic if a woman was there. The partner called and was super apologetic, but said he couldn't change the mindset of the leadership. And I think for me, that's not being able to disrupt the culture that you have, right? To make room for others. And perhaps this is another, you know, pretty big turning point for ones versus the others. So this one I'll do pretty quickly, and then I'd like to do an exercise where we're going to do a case study. So this one this will just be kind of a 45-second intro because I'm looking at the clock. So one of the things I'd like to challenge all of you to do in this consider action exercise is to think about what is the one thing that you would like to change, either as an individual, as a firm, or in the profession, and commit to that action. And it's just that simple. You know, I want to change the present state in order to, and the desired outcome. Why is this important? Because many times some of the initiatives or the action plans that we put together reflect some of our own biases. So for example, there's a lot of conversation about the architecture pipeline. And so we make assumptions about how we can improve that pipeline, whether that's putting in quotas, whether that's creating action over there, without thinking about the desired outcome. And so I'm going to challenge you as you go forward and kind of do this work as individuals, firms, or in the profession, think about that desired outcome and ways in which your actions can support that desired outcome rather than what you just think needs to be done. And that's sort of a nuance. 5 questions that you can ask about equity in your own organization. So where are the men and women in your organization? Right, what are they doing? What are the tasks? Are there certain assumptions? So ones that I've heard commonly are women doing a lot more of the interiors work, or women as project managers, men doing exterior details. Like these are things that I've heard. It's important to do that work to find out whether one group is underrepresented. Do you proactively manage pay equity in both base salaries and base salaries plus benefits, right? And there's state and city ordinances that sort of help think about pay equity. Do we provide sponsors along with role models, some of which are counter stereotypes? So many times we might think that if there's a person of color, they should have another mentor as a person of color. And while that is important, it's also limiting to counteract some of the stereotypes. We don't always have to pair people who are similar to each other, that we can learn just as much from people who are different than us. So I just sort of put that out as a counter exercise. Also, what is the impact of our policies, practices, programs, and formal commitments on making our culture more inclusive and our numbers more balanced? So that's sort of the action exercise I was talking about. And do we have those uncomfortable conversations on what needs to change in our organization? So challenge yourself a little bit to have those uncomfortable conversations.
And I think, Emily, in general, the uncomfortable conversations goes both ways, right? So it's uncomfortable to bring it up from the person that is feeling this bias or this inequity. And it's also very uncomfortable for the person who doesn't know that they have been part of this inequity. And so it's uncomfortable from both directions, and it's just going to be the way it has to move forward, or it won't change. We have a couple of questions that I know you wanted to, do
Yeah.
you want to take them now or do you want to take them after we?
Why don't we take some of them now?
So the one is, how do you recommend addressing individuals who minimize the importance of adjusting the language that we use? For example, people who continue to use figures of speech that have racist history even after being told the origin of those phrases.
Yeah, I think you just have to continue to do it. And I hate to say that, it gets back to the context. So you've given someone the background, and they're either choosing to ignore the information that you've given, or they just, it's the, it goes back to sort of like the often right, never uncertain type of phrase that I sort of get back to. Um, I think you just have to keep doing it. If you can't do it on yourself, get some allies, and go forward. It's difficult, but I will say that in many cases, it's just a pattern of behavior that just continues to need to be called out. And I wish I had a better answer for you. I really do. Does
And then
anyone else have a better answer for how do you counteract someone once you've told them 10,000 times? I mean, the thing that's really, really awkward, and you know, I don't always personally experience this, is when someone mispronounces your name, right? Um, Sometimes people will say grandstand instead of grandstaff. I've gotten used to it, and it was funny kind of in the beginning. But I know for others, they have a situation where their name is continually mispronounced, and it's exhausting having to correct someone, but you just have to keep doing it.
there's also questions about, are there any known resources out there to support generating a JEDI action plan? JEDI is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So, and then there's also sub-consultants to the organization should be included on the list. And just to add to that, we are Rachel and Dan and the EDI knowledge community, are going to start creating some kind of a checklist or a resource for firms. So that's something that's part of our goal for August or for so that we can do that quickly. And then in general, I talked to Jane Frederick yesterday, who's the AIA president, about what the AIA is doing so we don't duplicate their work. But I think that's something that I've heard from some firms that have really good ways of counting salary, equity, and women and minorities in their groups. And it's eye-opening once they do all of this work. So I have some information that we can start using for that. And then
I really want to touch on Tom's question because I think
yeah,
Tom's is really important. Do you want to read it out?
sure. With regards to gender discrimination in our profession, there are many areas we can address right now since women make up more than 50% of the profession, at least at the entry junior levels. But with regards to racial equity, especially for African Americans, there's such a small number in our profession. So that would mean, in addition to bias training, proactive advocacy, and cultivating interest and growth in architecture. How do we best do that?
That's a great question. Tom, you're absolutely right. And it's not just African Americans and Black architects, but it's also obviously Asian Americans, Latino, Native Americans, many, many other ways that we can describe ways in which people identify ethnically. So there's a pipeline issue. So I think it's K through 12. So supporting K through 12 education, also supporting students, so pathways to college in terms of how do we can create articulation agreements from 2 and 4 year colleges into NAB accredited degrees. Once in college, providing scholarship support, also mentorship and sponsorship, entry level, mid level within that, and ways in which we can make sure that we attract and retain a much larger representation of the society we serve than we do currently now. That is, I think, the probably the most succinct way I can say it, but it's a multi-prong. There's no one way that we're going to do it. We're going to have multiple pathways. I think JUST is a good platform for data evaluation. Someone had said, so the JUST certification. I think there's also JUST Plus. There's lots of other ways. The AIA is collecting data on equity in the profession. We did a formal study in 2015, but that's going to be continuing. One of the major things, Sarah, was that there's a survey that goes all to member firms every 2 years. In 2017 was the first time that we started to collect that data. It was pretty scary, but ways in which firms are addressing equity, diversity, inclusion, and be able to track that over time. I mean, I would love to see the 2021 data when it comes out, to see if that's really made a dent going forward.
Emily, we're also trying to figure out how to do it better at the BSA, because sometimes firms renew for people in their firms, and so we don't have all the data for that. So Eric is looking into that. But another piece of the 50%, Tom, that you mentioned, yes, there are 50% in the schools, but as Emily knows, because she and her group put a whole report for AIA, by the time you end up at 10 years in the profession, only 17% of women and 3% of African Americans and Latinos remain in the profession. And there's a reason for that. So I think that's what we need to work on.
Yeah, it reinforces the point that there's no one answer. There's so many nuances to this. So I'm looking at the time and sort of also want to talk through a little bit of, and I'll kind of speed through this, but the AIA did revise its Code of Ethics in 2018, explicitly to address some of the issues of sexual harassment. So I'll sort of point out one of these points, and we made it a rule. Previously, it was, how do I say this? Rules are enforceable. And previously it was, and I forget what the legal term was, but it was a standard. And so now it's reinforceable. So members shall not engage in harassment or discrimination in their professional activities on the basis of race, religion, national origin, age, disability, caregiver status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And so that was a big, policy sometimes gets, it's sort of not exciting, but it is important in that that's enforceable in the member code of conduct through the National Ethics Council. Another conversation that's happening right now is in terms of justice facilities, in terms of a code of ethics change that we made a rule, again in 2018, which is members shall not engage in conduct involving wanton disregard to the rights of others, just so that you're aware of those two. Obviously, employees with mutual respect and equitable working environments as well. I think I talked a little bit last time about how the conversation that started in 2017 was about equity, diversity, inclusion, but I think the place that we really need to expand this conversation is in social justice, and ways in which we can have those uncomfortable conversations about how our designs and our behavior as a profession have impacts on the built environment and the people who use the built environment, and ways in which we can understand layers of systematic injustice in urban and public and other design, and ways in which how we can dismantle that now. And so I find that to be a really fantastic opportunity for us to reconcile some of the impacts and also the behaviors that we can go forward in the future. So I'm going to leave you with this. If you download the guides, there's some case study examples. And these are really great ways that you can start to have a conversation with your own firm or with individuals or a study group. And I was hoping maybe to do some of these today, but recognizing the time, it's not necessarily going to be amenable, but please download the guides, because it's got, I just skimmed the surface here. There's a lot more that you can go into in the act sections as individuals, right? And so it goes into depth of here as firms, or as, here's the firms one, or as professions. And at the end of each guide, there's a consider section. And these to me are always very interesting, because it tells, this is a real story of someone and their own experience. And in the end, there's guiding questions so that you can be able to understand or have a discussion with others. And so the content of the guides were to, how can we introduce this topic? How can we give you data, both unique to the architecture profession or to the business context? how can we provide resources for you to be able to act and do things with this information? And also, how can you develop your own nuanced understanding in the consider exercises? This is just the first guide. There are 8 more. And so I sort of want to also say, and thank you, Haiti, for putting the link up there. You know, this is going to be an ongoing conversation at the BSA. It's been such a privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce the first one to you in 2 sessions here. But I think we're also going to look at workplace culture. We're going to look at equitable communities. We're going to look at measuring and representation, as well as sponsorship. I mean, there's many, many more conversations to go. So kind of leave it at that, and please dive into the guides as much as you can.
So thank you, Emily. So on behalf of the BSA, thank you to Emily and to everyone who participated today. We had a really great showing. This is a really important conversation, and it's just the beginning. So we're going to be continuing the conversations on each of the guides moving forward. So stay tuned for that. Also, make sure that please join us on July 28th at noon for the series on race and architecture, where you will be able to talk to and hear from Black architects in Boston of all different generations. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for contributing to the conversation.
And I'm happy to stick around if anybody wants to stick around, kind of like last time. But yeah, all good stuff. Otherwise, if you can't stick around, I'm very respectful time. Thank you.